Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with Toronto-based jazz multi-instrumentalist and songwriter Lennox Campbell-Berzins. We caught up with him to talk about his new and debut 2024 CD, Lullabies for Lenny, and his life in music. This album is a departure from form for a musician as it stands as a jazz guitar album that implements the rare, unique, and widely undiscovered technique of harp harmonics, popularized by the great Canadian jazz musician Lenny Breau. We cover quite a ride in music. Enjoy.
I like it.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you reached out to the show. It's great to connect. I'm looking forward to getting into the brand new album, your debut, Lullabies for Lenny. And, so thank you for taking a minute out. And I'd like to begin our journey before we get into the new album by asking, 4 years ago, musicians especially were trying to figure out how this whole pandemic was going to shake out. How did you ultimately get through that time period, and how did it either influence this album or what you do now in general?
Oh, man. Yeah, great question. I feel like, I was lucky because most of my income's done from teaching, teaching in person, a lot of kids and stuff, right? So then when we went to lockdowns, I just went completely virtual, which is an entirely different world, but I was very fortunate because I had I'd say 70% of my retention rate for students. So I was very fortunate in this. But a lot of my friends who are musicians or bookers or promoters, venue owners, they really suffered a blow. So I was kind of lucky in the long term. I found, honestly, I started recording more solo. So I put out solo records, which is more my original music, not associated as much with jazz. But then in that time, too, I found it helped for this album where I was just finding myself alone and able to kind of flush out arrangements more, starting to really dig into the harp harmonics and all that stuff. So it kind of was a good time for woodshedding, I would say, because there wasn't much to do. You're kind of sitting around and then you realize, I can actually get better at this, which is, I guess a blessing in disguise. But I feel like I was very fortunate just having the teaching work that without that, I'd be in a different place entirely. And I always think, I said this to my students, imagining if this had happened, even 10 years before, completely different story, like Zoom calls, right? Like, what is that? So having to do a lesson over the phone or something, or have to fax homework, I have no idea. So, yeah, that would be my take on it. That's my experience.
So this is your debut album. That's a big deal. Your initial shout out into the world of jazz. Talk to me a little bit about how you constructed this album and how just overall it feels. I know that albums are a real labor of love. They take a long time. How does it feel?
It feels good. It's daunting because years ago I would have studied jazz more when I was younger. In my 20s, I did a degree in music at York University here in Toronto. And actually I was more primarily specialized in piano at the time. And so I had a bit of a taste of the jazz world there. And then coming out of school, I would have played some gigs and things like that. But all to say, I think one thing I never got over was my love for Lenny Breau, the guitarist, Canadian-American jazz guitarist. And his influence with harp harmonics has always been profound for me. And I started in my early 20s arranging guitar compositions for harp harmonics. And I was trying to think about what it would be good foundation for this thinking around just, basing arrangements off of this. Is it going to be pop? Is it going to be whatever? And I decided to really dig into old school, going more for ballads, the old jazz standards, American jazz standards, and really digging in that way for harmonic complexities and stuff. And also ballads that I'd always loved that I either heard Lenny do or similar artists. I was really influenced by Chet Baker as well. So a couple of ones, the one track, Moonlight Becomes You, I would have heard first time off the Chet Baker record back in the day. It feels daunting because the jazz world to me is a very different beast. I'm I think I was very scared at first because, it's high caliber music, in my opinion. It's kind of like, how high can you go? If you do a classical record, you're doing Bach note for note, but your interpretation of something jazz related, it can be very open-ended. So I was very afraid at first, but I also thought I've had some of these arrangements for 10 years. I need to get them off my chest. I need to put them out in the world. I've had some of them for too long. And I think there's a good thing at any point in time for a musician, the process of moving forward, right? You spend enough time with a record, like a painter, you have these brush strokes, and eventually you want to move past it. I feel like if you sit on the same portrait for a lifetime, it's great. It might be your masterpiece, but also it's great to feel the sense of, progress and moving forward and leaving it and finding closure and stuff. So it's daunting. I've been very nervous about putting it out, but I feel very good despite it. And there's things I would change. There always will be, but I feel very happy about putting this out in the world finally, after all these years.
So what are you ultimately hoping with this debut that the listener gets from this album?
Yeah, I would love for the listener to take a moment to really take in the idea of this concept of the harp harmonics. Because the reason I started doing it, I feel like when I discovered Lenny Breau, it was around the time I was really getting into jazz. And I never heard quite the sound of harp harmonics. And I didn't know what they were. I remember listening to this great album of him and Dave Young, live on Bourbon Street. It's my favorite record of his. And I was maybe 17 or 18, and I heard him doing the harmonics, and I thought, is this a synthesizer? I couldn't really put my finger on it. The same way I felt when I first heard Les Paul with sped-up guitar. And so it was so defamiliarizing. I really wanted to get into what I was hearing. But the thing that I find sad in a way, harp harmonics is a very underrepresented art form. I feel like it's the final frontier of guitar. Because we all know about like Eddie Van Halen tapping, and there's so many extended techniques on guitar now. But harp harmonics has not really been deep dived a lot. And I was going around trying to look for other guitar players. Like there was Lenny Breau, Ted Green, Tommy Emmanuel will do it as well. But it's kind of this esoteric thing that only exists in the jazz world. But I wanted to see if I could go about an approach of like really how far can I take it where most of the album is using harp harmonic technique. So really giving it, trying to shine a spotlight on the technique, but also on Lenny Breau. So anything else, I would love for some people to take this away as, hearing what this technique can do. So any other guitar players thinking, oh, wow, harp harmonics are a thing. This is great. Or even deep diving Lenny Breau. Just bring some awareness to the technique because I love it so much. And the thing I find hard is that even within the guitar community, let alone jazz community, it's not that well known, and it's a technique that I just love so much. I would just love to see it more common in other places too. So I give at some point I might even do a book of instruction manual for the technique because I got really comfortable with it. I would love to see more resources for it because it's very underdeveloped in a way. I don't want to say underdeveloped, but not as well known as other techniques for guitar, and really only the jazz community. So I would love this to put a spotlight on Lenny. I'd love to put a spotlight on harp harmonics of what they can sound like as well.
So take me back to the beginnings here. How did music become your world, and how did jazz kind of become your career path? Yeah,
it's funny. I always call myself a bit of a late bloomer for music. I would have started piano fairly young. I would have tasted it around 8 years old. I only got really cooking at around 14. And it would have been more from the rock side of things. I was very much influenced by classic rock. And there's this funny little moment people ask, when did jazz come up? I always say it was kind of this ushering in. It was rock, and there was psychedelic rock, and there was progressive rock, and then fusion came up. And then by fusion, I think my mom had this extensive jazz collection for CDs. And I was just kind of reading up on the beat poets. I think I had a writer's workshop at school. And I had been reading about how some of those beat poets would listen to jazz. And then I went and picked out a couple of records randomly. I think one of them was Birth of the Cool Miles Davis, Live at Birdland Coltrane, which I think that one really hit ignition in me. Because I remember listening to that record, I was hearing McCoy Tyner, I was hearing Coltrane. And I think it just kind of clued into me all these artists that I loved from psych rock and even progressive rock and fusion. This is where it was coming from. Some of those concepts, the improvisation, use of modes and things. So I feel like overnight, around 17 years old, that's where I really clicked in. And then years later, I would have auditioned around 20 years old for a jazz program. But it was kind of the floodgates opened. Not too long after that, I discovered Thelonious Monk. So I was actually more of a piano player for a time. And then in the last, I'd say, decade, I've become more known for guitar. And it's been interesting, I think, for the harp harmonics, too, this idea where it is such a pianistic approach to guitar that for me, playing piano for so many years and having it be my main instrument, it felt kind of natural to try to translate that over. But I think it all goes back, honestly. It's like those 3 records. I had Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Thelonious Monk. Thelonious Monk was one of the ones where he resonated with me so much the first time hearing him. Yeah, I think it was the album Solo Monk, if I'm correct in remembering. And hearing Ruby My Dear. Ruby My Dear was the track that I could play that for days on end, and it would never get dry, no matter what. It kind of started there, but prior to that, I never would have expected going down the jazz path. If you asked me at 16 years old, I was just not there. But then overnight, it was like this complete epiphany that happened where I just realized all the music I've been listening to, especially in psych rock, progressive rock, were directly in line with some of this thinking. Like, it comes back to jazz, in my opinion, for a lot of those concepts and stuff.
So what was the first live jazz show you saw that blew you away?
Oh, my gosh, yeah. That's a great question. I would have I would have been an undergrad probably in first year, and we have the Rex Hotel in Toronto, which is, it is the cream of the crop for jazz. So a bunch of my professors would have been playing there, rather. I think I went and saw some of my profs play. One of my teachers at the time, Lauren Lofsky, jazz guitarist, he played with Oscar Peterson. Incredible guy. And I remember going to see him, and I forget who else was on the bill, but it's kind of like the who's who. It's almost like if you go to any of the universities for jazz in Toronto, you're going to see this amalgam of like those profs on the same stage. He was playing, and I forget exactly the rhythm section. It might have been, I think maybe Kevin Turcotte on trumpet perhaps, or something like that. But they were on fire, and I couldn't believe how tight they were. They didn't seem to be watching each other. They were just listening, and they were so locked in. And I think they counted in something like All the Things You Are in 7/4. And I was watching and just being like, I was really having a hard time. And then hearing them solo over that, I just thought, this is next level. I can't believe this is actually happening right now. So I might have been seeing one of my profs playing at the Rex, but I think that would have been the first moment. And when I was younger, too, my mom had a great love of jazz, so she'd go to jazz clubs. I would have been there a couple times when I was younger, but at that age, I just wasn't really listening the same way. But the Rex Hotel, it would have been one of my profs. I'm going to say maybe Lauren Lofsky, because he would have been one of my first. And he just it was just incredible to me. Yeah. And I think there was this moment, too, the classic quoting and solos. I think it was around maybe the holiday season, and he did, like, this very disjunct version of, like, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer in the middle of his solo. And it was just like, and that moment, too, it's so playful, too, that the entire audience burst out laughing. I could laugh along to it. It was just this moment. Yeah, and that was kind of neat, too, to see that in the jazz world. There is that kind of a sense of play that I think people forget. I think a lot of people think, and I got a sense of it, it can be serious, but it also can have a lot of fun and levity to it. And it kind of showed that for me, which I really appreciated back then, being pretty young, starting out, and that really struck with me. Yeah.
I think the one thing along with live music kind of being the theme right now, one of the big things for musicians is finally getting to that point where you get on a stage that you always dreamed about or witnessed. What was that stage for you where you finally got on and you're like, wow, I can't believe I'm here?
That's a great question. I think that's actually a really hard question. I'm trying to think back when that change would have happened. There's a couple of venues here in Toronto that I've played at back when I was younger. It would have been more for the rock side of things. And I think for that, it would have been, there's this place that we used to have called the Silver Dollar Room. And it's pretty legendary for more the rock community. And I remember playing there the first time. This might have been 10 years ago or so. And I remember a feeling of like, okay, I've finally made it to this location. And so, it was a smaller venue, but very well known, quite well lauded in this sense. And so that hitting that stage was a big one for me. I think, I'm really struggling to think of another spot off the top of my head. Eventually, I would love to, one day maybe do something like the Rex or something like that. But I think it might have been, Silver Dollar back then. And if I go back far enough, I could also say there was a old band I used to play in, we did play Lee's Palace. And this is a bigger venue in Toronto. I don't know how we got in the bill. It was very dead. And somehow we were locked in to do that. And that was back when I was more of a piano player, and I was still coming up doing my jazz thing with the piano. So it felt really great to have a bigger venue to get to showcase some good solos and things like that. But that was a moment too, stepping onto a stage like Lee's Palace where I'd seen these legendary bands. That was next level. And then for, I think, locally around here, I think for jazz, I think the Rex for sure. But the Rex is so iconic, and so it is really just like it is a big part of the creme de la creme of jazz here, that I almost still, even to this day, feel a little intimidated to play it. So I'm working up to it. I'm going to keep practicing, and maybe one day I can actually step on the Rex and feel comfortable. But even then, I don't think I'll be completely comfortable. But that's the whole point, right? Sometimes it's nice to have some of those nerves, that kind of, what would be the word? A little bit of angst coming up,
Totally, yeah. So at the end of the day, what is it that you like the best about being a professional musician? What gets you up every day? What motivates you the most?
Oh, yeah, I think these days, I found when I was younger, it was about trying to be better than I was the day before, for sure. And trying to kind of chase the shadows of these greats, these legends. In my case, it was for the harp harmonic in this album, trying to kind of chase after Lenny Breau a little bit. I'll never be like Lenny Breau for so many aspects of his playing. He is such a anomaly, and I really think he's undervalued in the guitar community and the jazz community, because I think of him as being my favorite, perhaps, at this point. But what gets me up these days, I think, more and more is the recorded music thing, and the idea of putting out albums. For a while, it was a lot of my original music and stuff like that. This is the first record where it's jazz, but also pretty much all covers. But the idea of having a body of work, almost like thinking of musician as a painter now, really appeals to me. So this idea of trying to leave behind a document, trying to leave behind this record of all the things that you've done, because we can do that now, where a performance is amazing but then at the same time you perform and then it's over. But I love the idea with records and recorded music that you're leaving behind these documents, the same way I can listen to Coltrane, right? I wasn't alive for Coltrane, but I can listen to him now. The sense of leaving behind a document keeps me alive. I love the idea of kind of putting these kind of chapter ends into my life. And I do find it's easier to document my life. People ask me about what was happening this year I was alive, as an adult when I was, been gigging or recording. And sometimes if I have an album, I can almost go back and teleport back to that time, an album that I've done where I'm like, oh yeah, I remember where I was exactly for this album or that time period, where the year might just run off like water if I didn't have that, perhaps. But I really love this idea now, really trying to approach this idea of musician is painter, that I can add brush strokes, so you have a completed piece at the end of it. That really brings me up, wakes me up to start my day, essentially. Whereas before, it was more about chasing after, let's say, one performer, be it Thelonious or Lenny Breau and stuff like that. But I think now it's more about slowly just trying to kind of make, leaving behind a document, if I can, gradually over time.
So I know that you're diversified and there's other parts of you other than jazz, but at the end of the day, why do you love jazz?
Oh my gosh, yeah, it's a great question. I think it's something, the harmony has always fascinated me. I think even when I was young, getting into rock music, for example, one of my biggest influences has always been the Beatles. I grew up listening to the Beatles. I loved the Beatles at a very early age. And some of the tunes, their choice of chords, always was interesting. Early on when I was plunking away at the piano, really starting out, I used to spend hours sometimes just kind of coming up with random chord progressions long before I had any theory or training to know what was happening in those chord progressions, but it used to fascinate me. So then I think getting into the jazz world and kind of tuning my ears to hear it a bit differently after a while, just to actually finally notice the harmony, what was happening in the chord changes, and some of the extensions too. I think the richness of chords. for me, I think it always comes back to some of the harmony, but also the improvisation, the rhythm. Like, for a time I also was doing a lot of drums. I actually was going to audition as a drummer years ago. But something so kinetic. And I think even thinking back to my first heard Coltrane, I was hearing Elvin Jones on those recordings. That he is also one of the foundations for so much rock music. So I think it's almost be like a three-parter. For me, it's very much the rhythm for sure, but then the harmony really captured my imagination of how far can it go. And the improv as well, the idea of like, you know, you are able to, you are impromptu composer in any given situation, that you have that freedom to redefine a melody, redefine a standard in this way. That kind of imagination really appeals to me versus something, I love classical music as well, but you know, how many different ways can you reinterpret Bach? Arguably, I would say there's, you know, a certain limitation. You can do tempo, you can do inflection, you can do expression differently. But if you're going to a show, let's say you're going to hear, I don't know, like Autumn Leaves, if you're in good company, you might hear it 7 different ways in the span of your life, you know, drastically different ways. Maybe you hear it down tempo or something. But there's this fluidity to jazz I've always appreciated. But the harmony has always been, I think, king for me in the sense of just seeing the richness of those chords, yeah. And even as a piano player early on, I was just drawn immediately to piano players, guitarists, for the richness, for those extensions. And even to this day, I mean, the thing is, the sky's the limit. I'll always remember one of my old profs, Lornowski, he was at the Rex, and this will always stay with me to the day I die. It's why I probably get up in the morning with this quote. I went and asked him, it had been years, he recognized me, and I said, hey, Lauren, how's it going? What's new? And he looks at me and he goes, oh, you know, just working up the ranks. And I just thought to myself, this guy played with Oscar Peterson. He's one of the best jazz guitarists maybe in Canada currently. But he's chasing the coattails of Coltrane. And that to me was just so inspiring, that he's humble enough to be still on that path. And the sky is the limit. Like, he'll still just keep getting better. He'll be able to, he's going to be a monster to the day he dies. Yeah, I think that to me is just so inspiring. And this sense of reinvention with the art form, that you can just keep going. Sky's the limit. So that's probably one of the reasons I love the art form so much.
So at the end of the day, Lennox, everyone has a perception of you, family, friends, fans, but you run the show. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
Oh my God. I always say myself, I think I'm pretty good jack of all trades a lot of the time. I like to think I'm a good teacher. I do a lot of teaching work these days. So I feel like my main thing, people know me more and more as being a teacher. I know myself to be a teacher. But I like to think of myself more and more. I love this idea, the analogy of painter. I like to think of myself more and more as a painter with music, where I'm trying to, as I'm trying to make more albums, especially because I play a lot of instruments, it makes it kind of easier. There's less, pressure to be amazing at one given instrument at a certain point in time. Granted, I really love with the harp harmonics, this is kind of the height of my ability on that instrument. So I feel like one of the reasons I'm putting out this album is kind of being like, this is the best I've gotten with the harp harmonics in a way. I like to think of myself, like kind of as a painter or tradesman, in the sense of like, there's a lot of tools in the box, and sometimes I'm very scattered with my tools, but I would say in this one case with the harp harmonics, I really went to town. I really wanted to hone in, okay, this is a tool that I don't use a lot, doesn't get a lot of use, that a lot of people don't know about, that I think really ought to be in more people's toolkit, myself included. Like, I still need to keep working at them, get them better. But, I like to think of myself more as this idea of like tradesperson, almost like a plumber for music or something, you know, jack of all trades. Sometimes if I pick one at a time, I can get pretty good at them. In this case, I feel really good about the harp harmonics. So we'll see once it's out. But yeah, I like to think painter, tradesman for the music form as time's gone on over the years.
So Lullabies for Lenny's coming out on October 11th, 2024.
You got it, yeah.
And if anyone wants to catch you live, pick up this album in earnest, any of the other things that are going on in your world, where can people go?
Yeah, I think eventually I'm definitely going to do a solo gig at some point for this, where it's just going to be the harp harmonics, the whole album. I might have a new original in the mix as well. And so I haven't booked anything yet, but keeping the ear to the ground for Toronto music scene here is a good idea. And then the album's going to be available for streaming and for sale on Bandcamp, as Bandcamp goes usually. And down the line, depending on interest, I would love to press it to something like, I'm a huge vinyl freak, but it's so expensive. So I'm just waiting to see how things go. Let's say if it did really well, I would, definitely love to have this one on vinyl one day. But the big thing too with this album is that it's a video series. So these videos are going to be coming up on social media, because I'm really trying to lean into, for this release, really have it not just the album, but also there are these really nice curated videos I've done with some friends of mine. They did really good work with the video quality and the editing and stuff. And also that it's a great opportunity to kind of showcase, again, the harp harmonics, where you get to see my hands real up close. Because even when I was starting out, I was always wondering, like, how is Lenny doing that? What's he doing? What is his hands like? And you can go online down a rabbit hole, and there's only so much footage of him. I've seen most of it, I feel like, at this point on YouTube. That's also, again, this visual document with the videos. So sticking to social media, you can follow me on Instagram. I technically have a TikTok, but it's very quiet. Maybe with these videos that does something. But keeping an ear to the ground, following socials. I'll definitely have a solo gig coming up around here at some point, which will just be the harp harmonics down the line.
Beautiful, man. This has been great. Thank you, Lennox. Thank you for your story. Thank you for your time. Best of luck with this debut.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited. Thanks for having me. It's been a delight. Yeah.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players and minds in Toronto, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. Thanks to Lennox for his time, energy, and cool. If you want to hear more Neon Jazz interviews, you can find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Subscribe to us at YouTube, and for everything Neon Jazz, go to theneonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.